Hit record. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our legislative preview webinar today. My name is Abigail Dorr. I'm the managing director of the Metropolitan Abundance Project. We work to make American cities prosperous, affordable, sustainable, and joyous places to live and raise families. And we help legislators and advocates transform great policy ideas into lasting real world solutions. And one of the ways we do that is work with great partners to develop model legislation that's our fresh starting places for legislators and advocates to learn from great policy other states and parts of the world have adopted and make it your own in your own state. Today we're here to profile three really wonderful pieces of model legislation from our partners. And we've partnered on this event with the Welcoming Neighbors Network, who have prepared an incredible messaging guide and resources. And we'll talk through how to talk about these pieces of model legislation. MAP, we are a resource. And if you want to work on any of these pieces of model legislation or others, we have a model legislation bank on our website. And they're vetted, adaptable starting points. And we're also happy to help you answer policy connections, connect you with the right policy leaders to make these pieces of model legislation your own. Let's get started with the model legislation and our first piece of model legislation that we're going to be talking about is the Room Act. And Sam Hooper is going to be speaking about this. Sam is legislative counsel at the Institute for Justice, where he advances property rights, housing choice, and economic liberty through principled legislative advocacy in Texas and across the U.S. And I love this piece of model legislation for Sam, and I don't know if he's going to say it, but this is really a piece of model legislation about love. Um, so take it away, Sam.
Thank you very much indeed, Abigail. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much to Metropolitan Abundance Project for having me. Yeah, I am Legislative Counsel at the Institute for Justice, here to talk about co-living and single room occupancy. I think, as a lot of us know, as the housing crisis has risen in political salience, we've heard a lot about certain kinds of housing reform, whether that's minimum lot size reduction, missing middle housing, accessory dwelling units, permit reform, single stair and building code reforms. But one thing that's been a little more overlooked so far was actually one of America's oldest and most traditional forms of housing, and that is single room occupancy or co-living, which is basically for the uninitiated, where you rent a private bedroom in a dwelling and then you share other communal facilities, often kitchen, bathroom, entertainment areas, with other residents. And this can be anything from just renting a private lockable room in a single family home, all the way through to kind of mid-size boarding houses, all the way to big, large-scale premium adult co-living buildings that are kind of like fancy student residences, I suppose. And as Abigail alluded to, this is kind of personal for me. Not only do I think this is good policy, but before I moved to America and became a lawyer, I was a management consultant living in London. You may have twigged from my accent, I don't originally hail from these parts. And as a young college graduate needing somewhere affordable to live in an expensive major city, I ended up choosing a co-living building. It was called Springboard Urban, and I rented a private room that had an ensuite bathroom. And then as a building, we shared kitchen facilities and a movie theater room and a gym and all this other good stuff. And it really promoted, not just was it good for lowering the cost of housing, it really promoted the social aspect of living as well. And in this building where I lived for a couple of years in my wild 20s, I met not only some of my best friends, but the woman who later became my wife as well. So this is indeed a bill all about love. So I'm proud to present to you today the Room Act, which is IJ's model legislation that would legalize single room occupancy in co-living building, which was once a super common form of housing in America, but has sadly been legislated out of existence. So if we could go on to the next slide, please, and just look at a little bit of the history of co-living. Um, so for decades, all the way through really till the mid 20th century, SROs, as they were called, housed all different kinds of people, single workers, immigrants, seniors, students. Um, has a kind of reputation of being kind of bottom of the rung housing or housing for poorer people. But it wasn't just that. There are many wealthy Americans lived in what were called residential hotels as well. So this was a common form of housing for all kinds of people. But by the mid 20th century, around the time a lot of urban renewal was happening, SROs made up around, I think, 10% of all rental housing at the time. So it was quite a scalable thing. And their disappearance wasn't, accidental. It didn't happen because of preferences. It was a deliberate choice made that began to, because of various reasons, because of prejudice about some of the kind of people that lived in these housing types, immigrants, poorer people, some moral panic, and some policy decisions. SRO housing was kind of zoned out of existence. It was made illegal through zoning that said you can only have single family homes or apartments. You can't have co-living anymore. It was gotten rid of through building code that said, oh, if you have so many rooms or so many people, you have to move to a commercial kitchen or have other requirements that made it too expensive. Or you had occupancy limits that controlled the number of unrelated people that could even live together in under the same roof. And for all those reasons, America chose basically to decimate its stock of this very affordable housing scheme. And as research has been done by groups like Pew Trust shows, there's a direct correlation between the elimination of this kind of housing and the explosion of unhoused homelessness and the housing crisis that we know today. So this is a very real, you can draw that direct line. It's quite powerful. So if you can go on to the next slide, please, and look at kind of the state of co-living today. So um, co-living today is massively decimated compared to what it once was. So I think we had if we had drawn a direct line showing, the growth of co-living, if we hadn't had that intervention, we'd have about 2.5 million additional housing units today compared to what we actually have, which is huge, right? That's not hypothetical. That's the scale of what we actually regulate out of existence. But fortunately, we are starting to see a comeback as some statewide housing coalitions begin to grapple with various different reforms, different policy levers that they have at their disposal. They're trying to slowly re-legalize some of these kinds of housing. So Washington State did this a couple of years ago in House Bill 1998. They legalized certain kinds of co-living anywhere that you can have multifamily housing, which is awesome. Oregon did something similar, not quite as ambitious, and Rhode Island just last session had an opt-in. So they let cities in Rhode Island now choose to have co-living as one of several different policy tools and housing types that they can legalize. So it's opt-in. Um, but one thing that we have learned, unfortunately, and these are all great bills and they're admirable, but partial and optional reforms don't always scale. It's better when they're statewide, and it's better when they are mandatory, when you preempt the ability of cities to just unfairly, arbitrarily discriminate against this kind of housing. And that's what the Room Act does. So if we can go on to the next slide, I'll tell you just a little bit about the Room Act and how it works. So the Room Act is designed to solve that scaling problem. At its core, it does three things. So first, it legalizes co-living and SRO housing. Those terms are kind of interchangeable statewide. And there's two versions. The maximal version would legalize co-living anywhere that's zoned for residential housing at all. So from single family, you can have those small, just renting a room in a single family home, all the way through to those big office conversions. And then the more modest version of the bill would just legalize co-living anywhere that's zoned for multifamily housing. And it removes all of the barriers systematically, one by one, that get in the way of doing that. So exclusionary zoning, it preempts zoning rules that would prohibit co-living. It gets rid of outdated building code requirements that don't do anything to actually add safety, but just add cost to co-living. And that's things around commercial kitchen requirements and operable windows in high-rise buildings, things like that. And then finally, it gets rid of arbitrary occupancy limits. So some of you might have heard of what they call Golden Girls bills, named after the famous sitcom where you have a bunch of unrelated people that wanted to live together, which is great. But unfortunately, in a lot of places, you can only do that in a sitcom because it's illegal once you get to a certain number of unrelated people. So zoning, building code, occupancy limits, this bill chips away at all of them and would legalize that so that you can then have this kind of housing statewide. And it does it legally and it makes it by right. So you don't have to apply for discretionary approvals. You don't have to go cap in hand begging to the city council to request this. As long as your building meets all of these requirements, then it's a ministerial approval and you're just approved, which would be great. And that would just kind of restore what was the status quo in America up until around the mid 20th century, which is great. If you go on to the next slide, which I think is the penultimate one. So why the Room Act? as I've said, co-living and SROs used to be a completely normal, natural rung of the housing ladder. I read a great thing a while ago, actually, that said during Constitutional Convention in America, when all the delegates were in Philadelphia, a lot of the delegates actually stayed in boarding houses. So you can actually argue that America was literally written in SROs. This was where the people that wrote the Constitution and ratified it came from. And again, we didn't grow out of this. It's not that consumer preference made these go away. We chose to decimate them, decimate this very valuable housing stock. And that shows up today in how house prices, scarcity, the problems we know today. Because if you get rid of the bottom rung of housing, guess what? People don't magically upgrade to fancy new build apartments and single family homes with white picket fences. They get displaced or they become homeless instead. I think we've learned that lesson now. So the time is right to bring it back. And this doesn't do it through patchwork ways. It's a statewide reform. It's across the state and it's by right as well, which is fantastic. So it's kind of at a high level what the bill does. And again, it does it by chipping away at those arbitrary rules around zoning through building code and through occupancy limits. So it's ambitious, yes, but again, all we're doing here is not doing anything revolutionary. We're just bringing back a form of housing that was super common, a form of housing that people's parents and grandparents would have absolutely recognized and which is already coming back today and which even a lot of us recognize from our student days, right? Many of us lived in these kind of buildings. I think there's one more slide maybe, or it might just be my wrap-up slide. So at the Institute for Justice, we're very grateful to the Metropolitan Abundance Project, who I consulted with a lot as we were drafting this model bill, for including it in their stable of model legislation. It's up on their website, which is great. The Room Act is a model, but the goal obviously is actually getting this implemented in states. And at the Institute for Justice, that's what we do. We love to partner with existing statewide and local housing coalitions to work on reforms, offering our own model legislation, supporting other people's as well. We like working collaboratively in those coalitions. So if you're interested in seeing the Room Act and re-legalizing this form of housing, we would absolutely love to work with you on that. My email is on the screen. I also run the world's most boring social media account at @LegLawyer on social media, where I talk a lot about zoning and co-living, particularly at the moment as well. So feel free to reach out to me there. But that's my spiel. That's the Room Act. This is how we can bring back, hopefully, co-living and single room occupancy in America. I hope we can do it and reach out to me to get it done. Thank you very much indeed, Abigail, for the slides and for having me here to talk to you all today.
Thank you so much, Sam. I have a question, and if you also have questions, feel free to add them to the chat. We have a couple minutes where we can ask for your expert advice. What if you're considering a piece of model legislation in a certain state, what is something to look out for that that could potentially weaken the bill or the piece of legislation that you've seen as you've adopted have worked with states in adopting this? I know Oregon or Washington has passed a piece of legislation. What have you looked out for and seen in sort of the pushback or dialogue in shaping the bill?
That's a really good question. Yeah, as with a lot of housing bills, the devil can really be in the details, and it's very easy for poison pills to slip in there sometimes. That come, in sheep's clothing, but are actually wolves, and they'll typically be things that try to introduce some kind of discretionary process or discretionary decision making back into the process rather than having it be ministerial. Anytime that you can't just show that your project meets these criteria and you're good to go, but instead you have to go cap in hand to the government to request an exception or a variance of some kind. That creates a roadblock or a choke point where local government or NIMBYs or other people that want to stop development in their backyard can get in the way of the process. So that's one thing that is quite significant. It's better when these reforms are statewide and apply everywhere. And another thing that we see sometimes is good bills that make a big difference, but they end up being cabin to only cities of a certain size or things like that. So um, I think one of our other co-speakers today knows well this. We were in a lot of the committee rooms together in Texas, where there was a great bill that would abolish occupancy limits in Texas. led by Texas A&M students, is an awesome bill. Unfortunately, that bill ended up being cabined only to certain college towns, so it didn't apply everywhere. And we would love to see all of these bills apply everywhere because we think, at least from the Institute for Justice perspective, it's best when this is statewide and not kind of arbitrary. So those are two things to look out for. Anything that introduces discretion and anything that just kind of cabins where these bills actually take effect based on the size of the city and things like that. There are others, but those are just two of the big ones.
Great. Um, we have another question from the chat. I'm curious, I'll make it two. What states have you heard of are considering moving forward with the Room Act this year? And how do you find a sponsor for the Room Act in your state or an existing bill to insert this into?
Great question. I'll take the second part first. It's a lot of begging and a lot of trying to charm, which aren't skills that come naturally to me, but I am learning. So state legislators are deluged a lot of the time with people waving their model legislation, wanting it to be filed, right? So it's always great to identify existing housing champions. And at IJ, we've been fortunate to do that with the Rube Act. So in Rhode Island, which I mentioned, they passed that opt-in version of a co-living legalization bill. So, and the representative who filed that, Representative June Speakman, big housing champion. She speaks to a lot of housing conferences. She's expressed quite a lot of interest in building on that. So, and it's not going to legislators that are housing champions saying, you've been doing it wrong. This is what you should be doing instead. It's here's what you've done. This is awesome. Here's how we can build on it to make it be even more effective. So that's kind of the approach that we take, try and find people. And it's always good as well if you can find people from a range of political points along the spectrum, from a range of from urban to suburban to ex-urban to rural, having that kind of mix as well. So yeah, a lot of charming, a lot of kind of begging sometimes, but we are hoping to see the Room Act filed in several states this session. I think it'll definitely be filed in Rhode Island, which I just love the poetry of that, like the smallest state geographically, re-legalizing some of the smallest homes, which I think is kind of poetic and awesome. But we got this to approval rather late in the season, so it may not be till next year that we'll see it filed, hopefully in a whole bunch of states. And by then we'll have learned a lot about, you know, the opposition that we encounter and good talking points to use and how to do it. So we're very excited about this and would love to get it filed in all of your states as well. And do reach out to me. I'm happy and willing to travel to come testify in support of the bill wherever you all are.
Oh, that's amazing. We have time for one more question for you. If statewide is best, but in states you mentioned Washington, Oregon, Rhode Island, were many municipalities passing local ordinance first, building for momentum for a statewide bill? How did those sort of come together?
Yep, that absolutely does happen sometimes as well. And that's often something that we've seen in Texas and other places. Some cities, Austin, for example, where I'm based, is a lot more housing forward, and they've already done a lot of the things that the state has been a bit more laggard to try and catch up on. And with co-living, we haven't seen, unfortunately, we've seen it kind of going the other way. So in Philadelphia, and Pennsylvania is another state we're looking at to get the Room Act filed. The city of Philadelphia actually has a city ordinance that I think just got pulled the other day, thankfully, that was going to limit co-living and group homes even more. So, yeah, sometimes, you get city leaders that, are forward thinking, that are YIMBY. Unfortunately, just because of the way that kind of local democratic pressure works, often it's the more local elected officials that feel that NIMBY pressure more. And that's why they tend to rely on the statewide officials to kind of push back and preempt some of that to take the awkward political decisions out of their hands. But yeah, there have been some moves. I know New York at the moment has a bill that's looking to legalize more co-living, which is great because New York was ground zero for co-living and SROs for a long time. So we'll absolutely be supporting that initiative. And often it's the bigger cities, anywhere where there's an influx of young workers, professionals, itinerant people, people that kind of come to a city for a few years, not looking to put down long-term roots. That's where we've seen co-living kind of moving forward the most. But it's not just good for those places, it's good for everywhere.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sam.
Thank you
Um,
very much indeed.
Next, we're going to be hearing about the Plus Act, maybe less romantic than the Room Act, but maybe there's an angle there. But Jim Manley is the state policy director at Pacific Legal Foundation, where he leads PLF state policy team in the fight for liberty in state capitals across the country. He previously served as an attorney manager and litigator at PLF, suing the government in defense of free speech, property rights, and economic opportunity. And he'll get extra points if he can make the Plus Act a story about romance. Take it away, Jim.
I don't think there's any romance, and my accent isn't as good. So you're in for a disappointment. But I think the policy is quite interesting. So hopefully that will keep your attention.
Definitely.
Let me put my slides up on the screen, and we can jump in. Um, can everyone see that all right? Great. So the Plus Act is intended to discourage downzoning and encourage the productive use of property. And so we'll get into what that means here. I'll also talk about some comparable reforms that have been passed in other states that the Plus Act kind of iterates on, and talk about what the policy implications are, and then we'll wrap up. And just to give you a preview of the wrap up, it's very similar to Sam's, where we, like IJ, we work with state legislators and allies across the country to get our model policies enacted and support other legislation that's moving that is aimed in the same direction and that is intended to achieve the same sort of positive results that our models are. And so that's where this is all headed as well. But we'll dig into the Plus Act here first. So what it does is prevents the enforcement of downzoning without either the consent of the property owner or compensation. And so what that means is when a local government passes a regulation that reduces the functional use of your property, if it reduces the density that your property is able to accommodate, the building heights, lot coverage, other building requirements that make it harder to build, restricts your ability to divide the property or sell it to certain people. Uh, all of these things lower the value of the property and upset your expectations about what you were going to be able to do with it. And as we've seen in the housing context, it creates new barriers to expanding the availability of affordable housing. And I'll talk about a couple of examples where we've seen this happen across the country in the context of some of the other bills that inspired the Plus Act. So when the government does that, when it takes your property and makes it less useful, it's making it less valuable, and it ought to pay you for that diminution in value. And that's essentially what the Plus Act does. It also gives you the option to say, no, I like these changes to the use of my property. I'm okay with it. Well, let's go ahead. And that's an important piece of it because it ultimately puts the property owner in charge of what's happening to their own property and empowers them to work with the local government to find a solution that works for everyone. Now, as I said, with this term investment-backed expectations, this is a legal term of art that we use a lot in the eminent domain and regulatory takings contexts, where you buy a piece of property and you expect to be able to do certain things with it. For example, an old mining community in Arizona, Jerome, sits on a hillside. It's a really weird place. It's haunted, of course. Weird in a good way, and it's become a tourist destination and really not much else. And so short-term rentals were very popular there. And this is going back now probably 10 years ago. And the city reacted very negatively to that development, as some local localities often do. They get scared about short-term rentals, but very peculiar in a place like Jerome, where tourism is really the main source of economic activity. Anyways, they tried to change that and ban short-term rentals, even though they'd been allowed for years, I mean, decades, really. And because of a reform similar to this that exists in Arizona, property owners were able to fight back and maintain their investment-backed expectations to be able to use their property in that way. So it's sort of the reason we call it the Land Use Stability Act is that it maintains those uses that you've always been able to put to your property, and then gives the government the option, if it really wants to take those liberties away from you, they can pay for that reduction in your value. But ultimately, what it's pointing local governments towards is promoting the productive use of land. It is encouraging them to make decisions about land use policy that increase the supply of housing, that make it easier to build, and that maintain the same level of productivity or increase it. Because of course, if they diminish the productivity, they have to pay for that decision. And our perspective on this, PLF is first and foremost a law firm. We've been litigating for 50 years in defense of property rights, economic opportunity, separation of powers. And our property rights work is really focused on this idea of protecting and defending constitutionally protected property rights. And we feel like this bill is a reflection of some of the same principles that we're fighting for in the courtroom to defend property rights. Now, of course, it's not just a blank check for property owners to demand the government pay for everything that it does that might reduce the value of property. So, if the government is taking an action in order that's necessary to protect health or safety, that's specifically excluded from this structure. So the government is free to do that without having to pay for the cost of imposing a fire code or a setback requirement that's related to safety. Those sorts of things are specifically excluded. There's also all sorts of land use restrictions that are necessary to comply with state or federal law. The Endangered Species Act might impose some restrictions on what you can do with your property. The Fair Housing Act, similarly, ADA requirements, all those things that are demanded by state or federal law are excluded from this. So it preserves local regulatory control over those things that are outside their control, that they're required to do, and that they really ought to be doing to protect health and safety. And then a key distinction here, and we'll get a little bit more into this in the next slide when we look at some of the other examples, is the PLUS Act is only forward-looking. And so again, it's the Property and Land Use Stability Act. It says the way things are today is the baseline. And if you want to deviate up from that and increase the productivity of property, great, go for it. If you want to deviate down from where things are today and make it harder to build homes, harder to use property, then you're going to have to pay for that. But it's only forward-looking. It doesn't eliminate any sort of land use planning that cities have already done, and it simply sets the baseline at today. So looking at some other states that have passed comparable reforms, um, uh, Oregon passed a similar reform several years ago, and it was a bit of a disaster. And so that's part of the reason that we've crafted the PLUS Act the way we have to be only forward-looking. The reason Oregon's program was I think everyone acknowledges a bit of a disaster is that it allowed residents, homeowners, property owners to bring claims for any regulation of their property. Even if the regulations had already been in place, had already been enacted, if they were simply enforced in the future, a property owner could bring a claim. And so you saw hundreds of millions of dollars of claims pop up almost overnight, and really pretty dramatically disrupt expectations. This was not a matter of land use stability. This was a revolution. And maybe from a property rights perspective, it's very pure and appropriate. But from a practical standpoint, it was a disaster, and it was quickly reversed in a way that really makes Oregon's existing law, although it does have some elements of this idea of the government paying for when it damages the uses of property. It's very narrow, and it really just doesn't apply in very many situations to be effectual. Now, Arizona learned from the Oregon example and passed in 2006 a more refined version of that, and it's somewhat similar to the Plus Act. Although what we've tried to do with the Plus Act is further refine what was passed in Arizona in 2006 and streamline some of the processes that are involved and really focus narrowly on this idea of land use restrictions that diminish the value of property. But some of the best examples of how this works come from Arizona. The example of Jerome that I gave earlier. The city of Flagstaff imposed uh, restrictions on where high occupancy developments could take place, essentially limiting single family homes to single family uses, no duplexes, no redevelopment for multifamily, um, and implying those restrictions in areas where they hadn't existed before. And so taking off the table all sorts of redevelopment that could provide greater density and supply the needed housing for a city like Flagstaff, which has been growing dramatically over the last 10 years, has a university there that's also been growing. And this really would have kneecapped the ability of property owners to respond to those needs and provide the needed housing. Fortunately, because of Prop 207, property owners were able to push back, and those restrictions were not imposed on the property owners who were able to fight back. And then the last example I'll give in Arizona was really one of the most pernicious I've ever seen. A property owner in Holbrook owned a Howard Johnson motel, modest property, but well maintained, and was trying to sell it. And the intention of the new owner was to create affordable housing at this property. The town didn't like that, and or the county, and so they rezoned the property to eliminate that use in the middle of the sale explicitly for the reason to control who was going to buy the property and how they were going to use it. Just blatantly out and out interfering with this private arrangement in order for the city to micromanage how it was sold and used. And again, fortunately, because of Prop 207, the property owner was able to fight back against that essentially bullying by rezoning, and was able to stop that. And then finally, North Carolina recently passed a reform that's quite similar to the Plus Act, although it doesn't define downzoning quite as well, and it doesn't provide for this mechanism of either consent or compensation, which we think is really important because there are situations where their property owners might want to have their property downzoned because they have a different idea of how to use it, or where the city, and we've seen this happen in North Carolina, imposes a reform that is upzoning most of the properties, but because of conditional uses or other historical regulations of property, some properties, even though most of the city is able to use their property in a more productive way, some properties would have their ability to use their property in a would be decreased. And so those reforms would be impossible to implement, even though they would be mostly good or and really uniformly good, because the statute in North Carolina does not allow for that sort of pinpoint exceptions, which the Plus Act would. So, in a nutshell, this works when it's done well, and we think we've done it even better than some of the states that have implemented this already in this model legislation. So just to kind of wrap up where this is coming from and what it's trying to do, we're trying to make land use rules more predictable and consistent across time. Um, and all of this is intended to make it easier to use property, easier to build homes, and easier to solve the housing crisis, which I think everyone agrees is a problem of supply, not keeping up with demand. And then, of course, it empowers property owners to stand up for their rights when the government interferes with them and demand that compensation if the government insists on applying the land use regulation to the property in a way that diminishes its value. So, as I said, PLF works all across the country to enact model legislation or legislation that tracks our models. And we're excited to work with anyone on this call or in states where folks are on this call, that if you're searching for a legislator to work with on an issue, we can usually help find someone who's excited about these issues and is a good partner on them. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jim. Are there any states we should be looking out for this year who are running the Plus Act.
I don't have any on my radar at the moment, but it's early days. So,
So everyone here, this is your moment to take the Plus Act and drive it home. Trevor has a question in the chat. In thinking about property rights, did you craft the Plus Act alongside or keeping in mind First Nations or tribes? If so, I'm guessing the Plus Act works differently on and off reservations.
I haven't seen how any of these sorts of reforms would apply in that situation. So I'm not sure. I guess if there are specific examples, I'd be curious to know. But it focuses on local governments, and so it most likely would just simply not apply to tribal regulations. But that would depend on how that those competing jurisdictions function within the state.
Well, let's move on to our next piece of legislation and keep your eye on the chat, Jim. We have a couple other questions coming in that we can answer in the chat. So our next model bill is housing on faith-based land, and Eli Smith will be talking about this bill, who was the director of the Faith-Based Housing Initiative, a program of Southern urbanism that empowers faith-based groups to build better places and communities through housing. And we'll also have a special guest who looks like she's freezing in Texas. Felicity Maxwell will be talking about your experience working on that bill. So take it away, Eli.
Hey everybody, it's great to be here. Abigail, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to talk about this legislation, especially because I'm finding out that it's being introduced more and more across the country this legislative session. So it's a really exciting year, and hopefully we can get more of these out there. So to give you kind of a brief background on faith-based housing, I mean, it's been around for hundreds of years, literally since the 1400s. And this was a very common way of housing folks, specifically elderly and poor folks in Europe, especially in England and in the Netherlands and Belgium. So you can see this really beautiful example from the Netherlands. This was really common, really up until kind of the turn of the 20th century in Europe. And it's actually been making a comeback recently here in the United States. A lot of faith organizations became very heavily involved in housing during the 60s, especially taking advantage of Great Society programs from the Lyndon B. Johnson administration to build housing in their cities. It's kind of been pretty much stable since the 1980s, at a stable rate since a lot of the reforms that came in under Reagan. But what's really important is that today we've actually seen a really huge explosion in faith-based housing and faith-based organizations rethinking what they can do with their land. Since COVID, really these three crises, the housing crisis, the faith crisis, and this loneliness crisis have really been shaping a lot of the faith-based housing projects that we've been seeing. So obviously, we all know about the housing crisis, but there's also this crisis of faith and faith land that has been coming up for available as congregations kind of rethink their property strategy, given some more difficult questions around what that is and aging facilities in particular. So housing has presented itself as one of the kind of natural options to do with that land. Really having a great option to expand and put more housing on that land, but also provide better community as well. So one of the kind of important things to think about with faith-based housing is that a lot of congregations are using this really as a way of reshaping their neighborhoods. It's not just kind of a roof over your head. It's not just a statistic that goes towards the housing crisis. It's also kind of reshaping the neighborhood, building community. So a lot of faith-based organizations, when they're thinking about housing, they think about that as one of the primary drivers of why they want to do it. It's not just kind of your typical everyday real estate interaction. So we've seen kind of a lot of different methods and modes of faith-based housing popping up across the country. Everything from tiny homes on one side, really often used to house folks coming out of homelessness, all the way up to big apartment buildings in larger metro areas. And what we've really seen recently in the past few years is a growth in kind of that middle range as well. So there are a lot of congregations doing townhomes, especially for sale townhomes, actually, to kind of promote home ownership. So there's kind of everything from small homes to large apartment buildings on the table here, which is really important to kind of keep in mind as you think through what this legislation can do and what kind of housing it can provide. So here's some examples of some successful legislation that we've seen over the past few years. SB4 in California, which was passed in 2023, has been super helpful. About a year ago, it kind of started to gain more legs, and in the past year, we've seen a lot more projects coming out of that. Because of some of the affordability requirements and the kind of mode that legislation was aimed at, we've seen mostly larger apartment buildings coming out of that project. Or out of that bill, excuse me. So that's something really interesting to keep in mind. On the kind of other end of the spectrum in Minnesota, we've seen this HF 1872, which was actually introduced to specifically legalize one form of tiny homes for faith organizations. So that's also kind of narrow in its own way, encouraging faith organizations to build tiny homes for folks coming out of homelessness. And then another approach that we've seen was in Florida with SB 1730 that was passed last year. And that essentially encourages uptake from more localities to pass their own ordinances. So that has less to do with on the state preemption side. But we actually have already seen a few different localities across Florida, probably most notably St. Petersburg, taking that up and encouraging faith-based organizations to build on their land. So a few important things to kind of keep in mind as we think about, how to introduce this to legislatures and more importantly, what form in which it's kind of most effective to help congregations build on their land. Everything should be fairly simple. The simplicity within this is paramount because congregations are not experienced developers. In many cases, they don't have to do this. It can make sense in certain regards. But if they don't understand the process, it becomes very difficult for them to justify doing it on their land. So each additional requirement and added complexity can decrease uptake, which is really important to keep in mind. The other thing is that each congregation has very unique motivations and context that's very particular to their own situation. So like I said, we've seen a lot of more uptake of like townhomes for sale. But the range in different projects and the demographics and the populations that those projects are aimed at really differs pretty significantly from congregation to congregation. And so kind of the broader that the legislation is to umbrella all of those different motivations is important to keep that in mind. And then, like I said, each additional element, probably most commonly is the affordability requirements can add complexity and make it more and more difficult for them to do things. In some contexts, this works, like in California, where the kind of large apartment building model has been fairly successful. But if we wanted the broadest possible uptake, kind of a broader, simpler bill is better, which is why I'm really happy about this Metro Abundance legislation, which allows localities to actually tailor their own affordability requirements to their own contexts, which is really important. And it's also it's an incredibly simple and streamlined version of this legislation that is really good. So kind of lastly, I wanted to talk about a few of the different states where this has been taken up this year and in past years. So we've seen it introduced but not passed yet in Colorado, in Texas, in New York, and Kentucky. Most recently, Virginia. Actually, the subcommittee has voted on it yesterday, and it looks like it may get punted to 2027, but we're not there yet. So if you're in Virginia, reach out to your legislators and tell them that you support this bill, and it should be passed this year. So I'm now going to really quickly just jump to Felicity Maxwell from Texans for Housing to give us a really quick overview of kind of what went wrong with the Texas bill.
Thanks, Eli, and thanks for this great overview. And I think because this Yigby approach is probably a little bit more familiar to y'all, and you may have heard the mixed bag that we had in 2025, I think we thought it was important to give you all some context of how these bills can run into some difficulties. I just posted a link in the chat that sort of summarizes what happened. And essentially in Texas, we ended up with a situation where because it would allow for additional housing for all faith communities, there were some difficulties in our very conservative state. We've since then tried to work on sort of changing that narrative because really, truly, our Yigby bill would not have actually impacted the types of development they were concerned about. But we've also learned a lot of lessons, which I think I'm happy to share here, which is one, even though you think that this should be something that conservative Republicans or people who are very tied to their faith communities are really excited about, that's not always necessarily the case because let's face it, they may still be NIMBYs. So that was definitely what we saw in Texas. The second thing is that I think Eli has really emphasized is that these types of developments can be all sizes and shapes. I think one of the keys that Kentucky has really taught us is that they're doing a very small version of Yigby as a start, and that's a great place. So it doesn't have to be multifamily that, houses hundreds of people. It can be tiny homes that just skip a permitting process. That's valuable too. So really figuring out which types of projects or what scale works best for your state is probably a great thing. And I think, again, Eli emphasizing the flexibility that's in the model legislation really is a lesson learned. And then I would say more generally, you can't just rely on faith communities to sort of fight this battle and win it. It is a housing issue, and a lot of faith communities actually felt ill-equipped to go to to the legislature. We saw that in Texas, but just generally, they don't necessarily know how to advocate around housing or zoning. It's not something in certain cases, there may actually be parts of the faith community that aren't excited about doing these types of projects. So sort of figuring out how to get those folks engaged in a way that feels authentic to them, but also helps you build that narrative, I think is really important. One of our key allies in Texas with the Catholic Conference of Bishops, because they've seen several successful faith communities build using excess land in Texas. So they're very powerful. And that was great because they had their faith community bought in. I would say that was less so for the Baptists, who are also very powerful in Texas. So, really thinking about how you can go to these faith communities, figure out what they want to do, and make sure that they feel engaged in a way that really works with what their end goals are, I think is important too. And again, that probably goes back to scale and size. I will say, I think both the Virginia legislation and the Kentucky, some of the other ones we're seeing this year, have been strengthened really through the process we learned last year. And yes, I think really keeping it simple, keeping it flexible, and making sure that you're listening to the communities who are actually going to build these units is probably the key things to remember as you move forward with these model legislations.
And then thank you, Felicity. That was really wonderful. And then I have one just very quick anecdote to tell people to kind of ground this in a story. There was actually a church in upstate New York that was trying to convert their facility into a ground floor community center and then two stories of housing on top of that. And essentially the housing would pay for the community center. But the local council actually came out against it and then downzoned the property, took away $1.1 million worth of property value from this organization that feeds the most people in their town. And so it kind of, that struck me as a really great case study of an important reason why this is important on more than just the housing, because that also supports feeding people. And it's also a really good case for both, that would have been prevented by both this faith-based housing legislation and the PLUS legislation, where they could have been compensated for that loss in property value. And then the happy note to end on is that those council members have actually been voted out, and so now their council is supportive of the project, and it looks like it's going forward again. So, but we lost 2 good years there of potential progress. So this legislation is incredibly important, and thank you, Abigail, for inviting me to talk about it. Abigail, I think you're muted.
Oh, thank you so much, Felicity and Eli. We have one question. With congregations not required to property taxes by law, have you found this to be a helpful element for advocacy leverage, or does this bring issues that get ironed out in the policy?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I've actually seen this kind of approached in a number of different ways. A lot of it can get pretty complex with the different kind of land lease models, and like we said, that there are a bunch of different models, and so some of those might be taxed and some of them might not be taxed. Really quickly, I think that the kind of important thing to keep in mind is that depending on the locality, some of them might see that as possibly taking out the opportunity for them to tax housing that they would have been able to tax, but now they can't. Some localities are okay with that, some are not, and so that kind of comes down on a very case by case, project by project basis, and I haven't really seen a good broad brush solution to that problem.
Well, thank you all so much for I love how these two pieces of model legislation tie together, the Plus Act, and we need all of these pieces of legislation enacted to really serve the housing needs of our communities well. But a group now we have Carol Watkins Chow, who is the Communications Hub Director at Welcoming Neighbors Network, who is going to talk us how to communicate about these pieces of model legislation and all other housing model legislation using your incredible housing messaging guide. So take it away, Kara.
Amazing. Thank you, Abigail, and thanks, folks, for taking the time today. Really excited to think about how we can use some of our research-backed messaging to elevate these kinds of model bills. So just quickly, I'm Kara Watkins Chow with the Welcoming Neighbors Network team, and as Abigail mentioned, as part of our national coordinating team, I lead communications work, providing support with messaging, digital media, press strategy across the network and for members. And so want to really look for opportunities to connect with y'all as we move forward. And apologies, y'all. I'm just realizing, can you see my screen okay? I'm using a different window here.
We cannot.
Okay. Let me try that one more time.
You're good to go.
Zoom bingo? Okay, amazing. So really excited to share today some top lines from messaging research that we conducted with Sightline Institute to find some of the most persuasive ways to talk about pro-housing policy at the national level. This research included nationwide polling of general public as well as qualitative and quantitative research with an audience of elites that mimics decision makers and their staff. So in this research, we found that a 5-step framework is especially persuasive with Americans across race, class, party affiliation, homeownership status alike. Before I kind of dive into this framework, though, I do want to emphasize this message guide is a starting resource, not a strict script. This is really rooted in broad national research, which we think reflects many communities nationwide, but may need tailoring for your specific context, your bill, your community, and you know your community best. So you can take what works and leave what doesn't. And I would always be eager to kind of hear how the road testing goes. So with that said, we find a couple of key points are most important. First, we want to meet people where they are, naming high costs to establish common ground for your conversation before you start to engage in the policy details and your specific solutions. We found it's also really important to specifically explain to folks how competition is a driver of higher costs. Most audiences don't easily naturally grasp kind of the economics of the housing market, the impacts of zoning regulation. And so really starting with plain language that points to familiar ways that competition drives up prices is really powerful. So, naming how, folks pitted against each other to bid for a home can drive up the cost. So really making that feel tangible for folks. Next, you want to lift up the experiences of sympathetic community members who are hurt by the housing shortage and make an abstract issue like zoning reform feel really emotionally compelling by pointing out the folks that are impacted. So young folks, trying to get a start, workers that our communities rely on who can't afford to live where they work, share those personal stories of folks impacted. And then as you introduce your policy solutions, really encourage you to make sure that your language is specific and concrete around any changes. We found that jargon, sort of policy nitty-gritty details, anything that folks don't easily understand, can really exacerbate folks' kind of anxiety around change. So instead of talking about middle housing policy, you really want to think about specific familiar home types like duplexes or backyard cottages. And then finally, you want to circle back again to illustrate how sympathetic community members will specifically benefit from more home choices, not only to tap into that emotional appeal, but also to remind folks that the housing shortage is a deep problem, but it is one that is solvable when we take clear action. And I want to just be mindful of time here, and share with y'all. There's a couple more slides here that I'm going to just breeze through that you can find the full version on our website. One quick call out for all the policy wonks in the room. Please visit our site, take a look at key do's and don'ts, and avoid jargon as much as you can. Talk about homes instead of units, connected communities instead of density. Really just try and, as much as possible, simplify your language to be accessible so that, these amazing and impactful policies can really be understood by a wider audience. So as I mentioned, on our site, you can see the full guide with more tips and tricks. Would love to keep in touch, set up a briefing for your team, think about how we could help apply this messaging to your specific fights, and would love to hear what else y'all are curious about as we conduct some additional message testing. Thanks, all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Oh, great. It's in the, and Felicity has added that link in the chat. I want to say thank you so much to our incredible panelists who not only did a lot of work to prepare for the presentation today, but also developed this model legislation and have been working with states across the country, legislators, activists to understand best practices, to tweak it and give us and share those lessons learned. And I'm just so grateful for all of you on the ground, and we're here to help. So please let us know how we can be helpful and what information and what you're learning about what's going well and what problems you're encountering and navigating this legislation. And it's a short session for most legislatures this year, so good luck in these wild times. And we're looking forward to hearing your stories and helping you out. Thanks, everyone.